The night was cold and silent when Kenji finally crossed the threshold of the old house he had inherited from his father. The building, with its weathered facade and moss-covered roof, seemed to have been swallowed by the very silence of Tokyo. As he stepped into the dark, dusty interior, a shiver ran down his spine. The walls, covered in peeling wallpaper and stains that told stories of decades, whispered secrets that time itself seemed to have forgotten. As Kenji explored the house, his eyes were drawn to an old box hidden in a corner of the attic. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if trying to hide what it contained. With effort, he lifted the creaky lid and, to his surprise, found a tangle of aged letters, tied together with a faded silk cord. Each envelope had a wax seal, still intact, with symbols Kenji couldn't identify. Curiosity drove him to open one of the letters, revealing elegant handwriting and characters that seemed to dance on the paper. The ink, though faded, was still legible enough to convey a sense of urgency and mystery. Kenji read the words aloud, trying to decipher the message that echoed with a tone of fear and regret. As he went through each letter, an unsettling feeling began to form. The stories told were about betrayals and feuds, about a powerful clan and its brutal downfall. But there was something deeper in the words, a sense of unresolved issues, a curse that seemed implied in every sentence. Kenji felt a chill when he realized these letters were not just historical accounts, they were records of something much darker. And as the night went on, the wind outside seemed to carry whispers from a past that Kenji was about to unearth, not knowing what it would mean for him and his family. Kenji was sitting at the desk in his new office, surrounded by stacks of yellowed papers and jars of dried ink. The letters he had found in the attic were now spread out before him, each one telling part of the story of a feudal clan that somehow seemed to be intertwined with his own fate. He focused on one particular letter, whose words began to form a terrifying narrative. The text described a bitter betrayal between two feudal lords, a power struggle that culminated in a brutal act of revenge. The descriptions of the events were vivid and distressing: bloody battles, stealthy murders, and, most unsettling of all, a sinister ritual to seal the betrayal and ensure that the revenge of the dead would be fulfilled. As Kenji translated the words, he felt as if the past was becoming the present. The stories of revenge and betrayal he was reading seemed to come to life around him, as if the ghosts of these events were beginning to awaken. Each word seemed to carry an emotional weight that transcended time, becoming palpable and threatening. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the house, breaking the silence like a scream in the dark. Kenji stood up abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest. He checked every corner of the house, searching for the source of the sound, but found nothing but the oppressive silence and growing darkness. When he returned to the office, he noticed that the letters had rearranged themselves in a strange way, forming a new message that seemed to have been written with desperate urgency. The message was clear, though the words were a confusing mix of archaic Japanese and disjointed phrases. Kenji felt a chill as he realized that the letter was warning of an imminent threat and mentioned an ancient artifact that could be the key to understanding the true extent of the curse haunting his clan. The sense of unease grew as he read on, each word seeming to echo with a sense of impending disaster. What Kenji didn't know was that these words were just the beginning of a much deeper nightmare, leading him on a terrifying journey to uncover the secrets buried in the darkness of the past. In the days that followed, Kenji couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that hung over the house. Every step he took seemed to echo back to him, as if the house were watching his movements. The sound of the wind, which had once been just a distant whisper, now turned into disquieting murmurs, and the darkness in the hallways seemed to stretch and contract, as if it had a life of its own. At night, the old wall clock, with its monotonous ticking, was the only sound that kept him company. But one night, Kenji was jolted awake by a noise that made him sit up abruptly in bed. It was a faint, almost imperceptible crying, but unmistakable. He went downstairs, guided by the flickering light of the flashlight he held. The sound seemed to be coming from the old dining room, where a table covered with a dusty linen cloth and disordered chairs created a disconcerting atmosphere. As he entered the dining room, the crying ceased instantly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Kenji scanned the room, trying to find a logical explanation for the sound. Looking at the table, he noticed something peculiar. One of the plates was slightly tilted, as if someone had touched it recently. His stomach churned at the thought that something, or someone, might be present in the house. The next morning, he discovered strange marks on the floor, which looked like scratches, as if something had been dragged through the house. The feeling of being watched grew even stronger. On an especially humid day, while Kenji was in the attic, he found an old mirror hidden behind a stack of boxes. He approached it and noticed something disturbing. A dark shadow, which didn't belong to him, moved quickly behind him in the reflection. Kenji turned abruptly, but found only the attic wall, empty and silent. With each new occurrence, the sense of presence intensified. He heard whispers at night, fleeting glimpses of indistinct figures, and sudden chills enveloping him, as if something invisible was nearby, watching and waiting. Each event seemed interconnected, a growing sign that the house and its secrets were about to reveal something far more terrifying. Kenji was sinking deeper into a nightmare, with an increasing certainty that he was not just dealing with his family's inheritance, but with something that extended beyond human understanding. The house was alive with an unsettling energy, and Kenji could no longer ignore that something very old and malevolent was manifesting in his life. The morning after the attic incident, Kenji found himself in a local library, determined to find any information that might shed light on the unsettling events he had been experiencing. The library was cozy, with its shelves crammed with old books and the soft light streaming through the windows, but Kenji barely noticed the comfort around him. His mind was focused on finding answers. He scoured books on local history and Tokyo's urban legends until he came across an old, dusty volume with a cracked leather cover. The title was in Japanese, but the approximate translation read, Asterisk Legends and Mysteries of Tokyo. Asterisk. The book was filled with stories about the city, but one legend, in particular, caught his attention. The legend spoke of a vengeful spirit known as a Yurei, a restless soul that returned to haunt the living in search of justice for a betrayal or injustice suffered during life. According to the account, these spirits were often linked to places of great suffering, such as battlefields or feudal palaces. The legend described how these Yurei could cause disasters and supernatural events until their grievances were heard and appeased. Kenji shivered as he read the description of a Yurei with characteristics that seemed to mirror his own experiences in the house. The legend went on to describe a specific ritual to appease a Yurei, a process involving offerings and complex ceremonies. There were mentions of ancient symbols and magical words that seemed to match some of the elements found in his family's letters. By the end of the reading, Kenji was convinced that the legend was connected to what was happening in his house. The unexplained events, the apparitions, and the growing fear he felt seemed to align with the description of a Yurei seeking revenge. The feeling that the house was linked to a much older and darker story than he had previously imagined was almost palpable. Determined to learn more about the connection between the legend and his own situation, Kenji decided to investigate the history of the buildings and events associated with the Tokyo legend. He hoped that by better understanding the past, he could find a way to deal with what was haunting his house and his life. The city, with its mysteries and shadows, seemed to hold answers to the questions tormenting his mind, and Kenji was ready to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows of his own past. After delving into the legend of the Yurei, Kenji felt an almost irresistible urge to explore the house's most hidden corners. The sense that something was concealed in the shadows guided him, leading him to revisit the attic with a more focused and determined gaze. On a rainy afternoon, Kenji began to search more thoroughly. Among old boxes and dust-covered furniture, he found a small, sturdy chest, coated with a layer of dirt and cobwebs. The lid was tightly shut, but curiosity drove him to try opening it. With effort, he managed to lift the creaking lid, revealing an interior lined with dark fabric and adorned with strange symbols. Inside the chest was an object that immediately captured his attention, an ancient mask, carved from wood with an expression that combined both fearsome and subtly human features. The mask was decorated with intricate details and symbols Kenji recognized from the texts he had studied. Around the mask were other artifacts, small charms, talismans, and an old sword with an ornate hilt. Kenji felt a chill as he held the mask. It seemed to emanate an almost tangible energy, and the feeling of being watched intensified. There was something about the mask that seemed more than decorative, its presence suggested a deeper purpose. He began to research the mask and discovered it was a shizoku, a type of mask used in ancient rituals to summon or control spirits. The mask represented a guardian, a protective spirit that, according to legend, had the power to keep Yurei under control. The discovery of the mask shed new light on the events Kenji had been experiencing. He realized that the house and the artifacts he had found were deeply connected to the Yurei legend. The mask seemed to be a link between the world of the living and the dead, a tool for appeasing or controlling the restless spirits that had been manifesting. Determined to understand the full purpose of the mask and how it fit into his family's history, Kenji carefully studied the symbols and rituals associated with it. He learned that the mask was to be used in a specific ceremony to deal with spirits disturbing the peace. The ritual promised to reveal hidden truths and perhaps even calm the Yurei haunting the house. With renewed determination, Kenji prepared to perform the ritual, hoping it would finally bring peace to him and the house. However, he was unprepared for what he was about to discover about his family's past and the dark role the mask had played in ancient, forgotten events. With the mask and ancient artifacts in hand, Kenji felt increasingly immersed in a world of mystery and darkness. He spent his nights studying the old texts and instructions for the ritual that could finally resolve the issues haunting him. Time seemed to slip through his fingers, and anxiety consumed him as he prepared to face the unknown. On a moonless night, when the house was shrouded in deep darkness, Kenji decided it was time to perform the ritual. He had followed every step meticulously, arranging the artifacts in a circle in the center of the main room. The atmosphere was thick with palpable tension, and the wind outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself were watching. Kenji began placing the talismans and amulets around the mask, creating a sacred space where the ritual would take place. The old sword was carefully placed on a stand next to the artifacts, its faint glow reflecting the candlelight he had lit. The room was illuminated only by the flickering candlelight, casting dancing shadows on the walls and creating a surreal feeling. With a racing heart, Kenji started reciting the words of the ritual, an incantation he had translated from the ancient texts. The language was archaic and strange, but the words came out with a force that seemed to transcend time. With each phrase spoken, the room seemed to react, the air growing denser and the cold becoming more intense. As Kenji continued the ritual, something began to happen. The environment around him started to change, the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and form indistinct shapes, as if taking form. A low, indistinguishable murmur began to fill the space, growing in intensity until it turned into a cacophony of whispering voices. Suddenly, an immense and oppressive presence made itself felt in the room. Kenji could sense an invisible force around him, and the temperature dropped sharply. He tried to stay focused, continuing the incantation, but the fear was almost paralyzing. The shadows grew more defined, and a spectral figure began to emerge from the ground, shrouded in dark mist. The figure appeared to have an expression of pain and anger, a Yurei according to the legends. Kenji knew he was facing a spirit that needed to be appeased, and the pressure of the situation almost made him lose his composure. He proceeded with the ritual, his hands trembling as he held the mask and placed it over the figure. The moment the mask touched the spirit was electrifying. A silent scream seemed to echo through the house, and a wave of energy surged through the room, making the candles flicker violently. The spectral figure seemed to writhe and gradually disappear, its presence fading with the intensity of the ceremony. With the ritual's end, Kenji fell to his knees, exhausted and stunned. The house seemed to have regained a sense of calm, but the weight of what he had experienced still lingered. The truth of the long-lost ritual was now clear, and Kenji realized that what he had faced was only the beginning of a journey that would reveal more about his family's past and the terrible truth buried in the darkness. After the ritual, the house seemed to have regained a certain calm, but the feeling of unease didn't fade. Kenji, exhausted and still dazed, tried to return to his routine, but something was clearly different. The silence that now reigned in the house had a sinister edge, as if the echoes of recent events still reverberated through the walls. One especially dark night, as Kenji was preparing for bed, he noticed something strange in the hallway mirror. The light from his lantern seemed to distort irregularly, creating shadows that moved in peculiar ways. Kenji approached the mirror, trying to understand what was happening, and then noticed what appeared to be a presence beyond the reflection. His eyes were drawn to a spot in the dark hallway, where the shadows seemed to writhe unnaturally. He felt a chill as he realized the shadows weren't behaving as they should. It was as if something was trying to manifest, an indistinct shape that seemed to move and transform with unsettling fluidity. Kenji blinked, trying to make sure he wasn't just imagining the figures, but they remained there, fixed in his field of vision. With his heart racing, he decided to investigate. With each step he took toward the hallway, the cold increased, and an indescribable fear built up in his chest. When he reached the point where the shadows seemed most intense, he noticed a disturbing detail. The eyes of a figure were visibly prominent in the shadows. They were dark, penetrating eyes, fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to cut through the darkness. Kenji tried to move, but his legs felt heavy, and the sensation of being paralyzed was almost unbearable. He forced himself to look directly at the shadows, and the eyes seemed to follow his every move, as if watching him with malevolent interest. A threatening presence loomed over him, and the whisper of the voices he had heard before returned, growing in volume and clarity. Fear turned to panic as Kenji realized the shadows were beginning to stretch and contort into more defined shapes. The figures taking form weren't mere illusions, they seemed to gain substance, with grotesque and distorted features that evoked a sense of horror. Desperately, Kenji tried to retreat, but the shadows seemed to extend and cling to him, as if the darkness itself were alive and an unrelenting adversary. He found himself struggling to breathe as the presence around him intensified, and the sense of oppression nearly made him collapse. Finally, with a muffled scream, Kenji bolted out of the hallway, desperate for any kind of relief. He locked himself in his room, fear still pulsing in his chest. What he had seen was a terrifying reminder that the malevolent presence haunting the house wasn't so easily contained. The feeling of being watched and the reality of the living shadows were now clearer than ever, and Kenji knew that what was happening was only a foretaste of what was to come. The tension around the house was mounting, and Kenji was consumed by a sense of desperation. Nights had become tormenting, with every shadow seeming to hide a dark secret. His mind was in a constant state of alert, and he felt increasingly driven to uncover the truth about what was really happening. On a rainy afternoon, while reviewing the old letters and documents again, Kenji found an unexpected piece of correspondence among the papers. It was a letter he hadn't noticed before, hidden among less significant documents. The paper was yellowed and torn at the edges, but the handwriting was clear and legible. As he read the letter, Kenji felt a wave of shock. The message was a desperate confession from a family member, detailing an act of betrayal and a burning desire for revenge. The letter described a horrific event, the betrayal of Kenji's ancestor by a close ally, leading to a series of murders and injustices that culminated in a terrible curse. The document revealed that, before his death, the traitor had summoned a vengeful spirit to ensure that his lineage would never find peace. The spirit, described as a particularly powerful and relentless Uriai, had been sealed in a specific place in the house, and its presence was a constant threat to anyone who was a descendant of the traitor. The revelation was devastating. Kenji realized that the presence he had felt and the events that had occurred in the house were directly connected to this vengeful spirit. The ritual he had performed was only an attempt to appease the presence but hadn't fully broken the curse. The letter went on to describe the details of the ritual that needed to be performed to finally calm the spirit and free the house from the curse. The ritual was complex and involved gathering all the artifacts and symbols mentioned in the letters, along with a final ceremony that had to be performed at a specific time. Kenji was stunned and horrified to realize that what he was facing wasn't merely a twist of fate but a long-standing revenge, a plot woven through generations of suffering and injustice. The responsibility to confront and resolve the situation was now clearly in his hands. Determined to finish what he had started, Kenji prepared to perform the final ritual. He knew this would be his last chance to resolve the curse and perhaps bring peace to his family and the house, which had now become a battleground of spirits. The weight of the revelation pressed heavily on him, but he also felt a resolute drive to end the torment that had haunted his life and that of his ancestors. As night approached and the storm outside continued to rage, Kenji prepared for the final confrontation, knowing he was about to face the vengeful spirit of his past and, with it, attempt to rewrite his family's history forever. The night was dark and stormy, with the sky illuminated only by lightning that split the darkness. The house was shrouded in a tense silence, as if the structure itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. Kenji, pale-faced and determined, prepared for the final ritual, which he hoped would be the climax of his journey. In the center of the main room, he had arranged all the artifacts he had found, the ancient mask, the amulets, the sword, and the fragments of the letters detailing the curse's history. The table was covered with a white cloth, with ancient symbols drawn in red ink. Kenji carefully positioned each item as instructed, creating a protective circle around the ritual space. With the house quiet and the storm raging outside, Kenji began to chant the words of the final ritual, an incantation that promised to break the curse and appease the vengeful spirit that had tormented his family for generations. His voice echoed through the room, and the atmosphere was charged with a palpable energy. As he spoke, the temperature in the room began to drop drastically, and the air seemed to vibrate with an invisible force. The ancient mask, placed on a pedestal in the center of the circle, seemed to come to life. Its carved eyes appeared to follow Kenji with a penetrating and malevolent gaze. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, beginning to form indistinct figures that seemed to move in response to the chant. The wind outside increased, and the storm intensified, creating a chorus of frightening sounds that seemed to merge with the whispers Kenji was hearing. He felt the spirit's presence manifesting, an oppressive sensation that almost made him falter. But he continued, forcing himself to maintain focus and clarity. With a sudden crash, a flash of light illuminated the room, and the vengeful spirit appeared in a ghostly and terrifying form. The figure was immense and shrouded in dark mist, its eyes glowing with ancient rage. Kenji felt a visceral fear as he faced the spirit directly, but he knew he couldn't back down. The confrontation was intense. The spirit moved swiftly, its manifestations violent and unpredictable. Lightning illuminated the room at unexpected moments, and the spiritual energy seemed to intensify, as if the space itself was being distorted by the force of the presence. Kenji, with his heart racing and hands trembling, continued to chant the incantation with fervor. With each word, he felt a deeper connection to the past, a link that helped him face the spirit with determination. He lifted the ancient sword and positioned it over the mask, as the ritual required, and with a final gesture, he completed the ceremony. The moment the last word of the incantation was spoken, a piercing scream echoed through the house, and the spirit began to disintegrate. The dark mist enveloping it dissipated, and the oppressive presence started to fade. Kenji, exhausted and trembling, watched as the spectral form disappeared, the room slowly returning to silence. The storm outside began to abate, and the sense of pressure in the house began to lift. Kenji fell to his knees in the center of the circle, feeling a deep relief and overwhelming exhaustion. The confrontation was over, and the curse that had haunted his family seemed to have finally been broken. But as the house settled and the storm subsided, Kenji knew the journey was far from over. What he had faced was a painful and ancient truth, and its impact would resonate for a long time. The house was now at peace, but the scars of the past and the lessons learned were an indelible part of its story. With the final confrontation behind him, Kenji was exhausted, but a sense of peace began to settle over the house. The walls, which had once seemed to whisper dark secrets and harbor malevolent presences, now emanated a silent calm. The weight of turbulent nights and oppressive shadows began to lift, and the storm outside finally gave way to a clear, starry sky. In the weeks that followed, Kenji worked to rebuild his life, though the experience had left a deep mark. He revisited his family's documents and artifacts, now with a new understanding of their significance. Each piece of his family's history was imbued with a deeper meaning, and Kenji began to see the house not just as a place of torment but as a testament to the resilience and struggle of his ancestors. In an act of reverence and respect, Kenji organized a ceremony to celebrate the newly found peace. He gathered friends and family, those he could trust, to share the story of the house and the journey he had undergone. The ceremony was held in the front garden, where flowers were beginning to bloom again after the storm, symbolizing a new beginning. Kenji spoke about the events that had transpired, the ghosts of the past, and the weight of ancient curses. He shared the story of his ancestors and the betrayal that had triggered the curse, revealing the sacrifice and struggle that led to its resolution. His friends and family listened in silence, many of them surprised and moved by the revelations. The house, now at peace, became a place of reflection and memory. Kenji made sure to preserve the artifacts he had found, placing them prominently in the house's library. He wanted the house's story to be remembered, not as a place of terror but as a symbol of resilience and redemption. The ancient objects were now carefully stored, serving as reminders of a past era and the struggle that had shaped his family's legacy. Over time, Kenji began to see the house in a new light. It was no longer a place of haunting but a refuge where he could build new memories and reconnect with his roots. The peace he had achieved was reflected not only in the walls of the house but also in his heart. He understood that by confronting the horrors of the past, he had found a way to rewrite the future for himself and for future generations. The house, now at peace, became a place of hope and renewal. Kenji knew that the scars of the past would never completely disappear, but he had transformed the dark legacy into a story of overcoming and rejuvenation. And as he walked through the house's serene, sunlit corridors, he knew he was living in a space that carried not only the memories of a troubled past but also the promise of a bright, shadow-free future.